All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Art Brunch, where we, of course, explore the wisdom of the arts, spirituality, and the greatest of ideas that humanity has produced. Let's go ahead and get started and continue with our series here. Myth and religion, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is part 5. By the way, the painting you're looking at is an image of both Apollo and Dionysus, the two Greek gods. We're going to discuss them in a little bit here. Now, the people of Africa have a saying, goes like this: God made humans because God liked to hear a story. I like that. God made humans because God liked to hear a story. However, since the Enlightenment and the ascendancy of scientific materialism, our most significant stories, embodied in our most cherished inherited myths, have become passé. Now, the definition of the word myth even went through a change so that it now means a lie. It's clear that Western culture has lost its unifying meta-narratives embodied in its myths. In our postmodern world, all our once treasured myths are considered irrelevant fictions, and all meaning and morals contained in them are considered relative. Regardless of whether myths are completely relative or not, I think we have all suffered because of this loss. Now, the big question modern people ask is, well, if I don't believe in the little truth of my inherited stories, my myths, how can they still have any impact on my life? Well, have you noticed that even if we have lost faith in our myths, we are compelled to continue creating them? Why is that? Because myths reflect the content of the human psyche, at least according to probers of the unconscious, like these philosophers and thinkers, Friedrich Nietzsche, the psychoanalysts Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, and the mythologist Joseph Campbell. You see, myths don't arise from nowhere, but come from within us. The human psyche is a kind of repository of collected knowledge and experiences of our ancestors, dating as far back as we can imagine. According to these great surveyors of the human psyche, we still need myths in order to understand ourselves better and to navigate life more effectively. Myths, therefore, serve as a kind of compass, helping each generation navigate the world and themselves better. Who are our modern myth makers? Well, of course, they are artists, painters, and sculptors. But in this digital age of media, they are our writers, composers, and filmmakers. These artists still call from the repository of past myths. Each new generation of storytellers adds another layer of both factual history and fiction to the myths, so that the themes and characters of myths address the needs and concerns of new generations. So let's look at some of these myth makers. But let's begin with our ancient storytellers, these artists of the past, and see what their creations reveal about ourselves. The first depth psychologists, according to Carl Jung, were an ancient Christian sect known as the Gnostics. Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowing. It was not a theoretical knowing, but an experiential knowing. The Gnostics believed we could have direct access to the divine without the mediation of the church. Artworks like this one, depicting Jacob's ladder, with divine and human traveling freely on it, does a good job of conveying this idea. Now, the artist of this work, William Blake, was by all accounts a Gnostic himself. One of the earliest church fathers, Irenaeus, 2nd century, claimed Gnosticism was a heresy, but he seemed most annoyed that Gnostics created new and ever-imaginative gospels, i.e. myths, filled with mythical characters, like the world creator Demiurge, who bungled the job, or Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, who created the flawed demiurge and then who fell herself into our physical world, where she was abused. Let's take a closer look at their myth of creation. Gnostics look around them and they notice that the world we live in wasn't exactly perfect. Most animal species kill other species in order to survive. They ask themselves, why couldn't we have been created differently? And modern people might be asking the question, why couldn't we have been created with something like solar panels attached to us to simply get the energy we need for life directly from the sun without needing to harm any other creature? And why were there so many natural calamities that destroyed life, like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, diseases? Why were humans flawed? Getting cancer or other ailments, snuffing out so many lives prematurely. Excuse me. Well, it must be because the Gnostics at least asked this question and concluded, it must be because the creator was flawed. So they posited the idea of the creator demiurge, a word first used by Plato and simply borrowed by the Gnostics. The demiurge was ignorant of its origins from its mother Sophia and the divine world, and believed it was the only God in existence. The demiurge therefore had no access to greater knowledge and perspective of reality. And so naturally, what the demiurge created was imperfect. Now, obviously, from a scientific perspective, this is hogwash. We might dismiss the story of the demiurge as an inadequate explanation of the universe, and therefore antiquated. But for psychoanalysts like Carl Jung, the demiurge represents something much more relevant to us today. The creator demiurge, unaware of its own origins and connection to greater resources of knowledge, bears a very close resemblance to the alienated human ego that has lost contact with its higher self. Now let's look at another important character in Gnostic mythology, Sophia. What you're looking at is a stunning mosaic considering its context. It was discovered at the 6th century monastery of Lady Mary in Beit Sha'an, Israel. It depicts a sun god and a moon goddess surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac. Christians interpreted these figures as Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the 12 apostles. This interpretation is very much in line with Gnostic myths. The Gnostics, you see, venerated Mary Magdalene, and some Gnostic sects associated her directly with Sophia, goddess of wisdom. If you recall, those of you who are familiar with the biblical story in Luke, Mary was abused by 7 demons before she was healed by Christ. Well, Sophia, when she became incarnate, was abused as well. Sophia's story is found most complete in the Gnostic text, the Pistis Sophia, discovered at the end of the 18th century, but dating back to the 3rd century, possibly earlier. In Gnosticism, Sophia is both analogous to the human soul or psyche and simultaneously one of the feminine aspects of God. Gnostics held that she was the female twin of Jesus, or the Christ, the bride of Christ. And she was also the Holy Spirit of the Trinity. And Christ, according to Jung, is also our higher ideal self. So this tale in the Pistis Sophia is a story of a journey of Sophia reuniting with her higher self, the Christ within. Sophia's problem in the Gnostic myths was that she had fallen into the material world because of an error in judgment. She tried to create without Christ, her bridegroom, her higher self. What she then creates of her life is flawed. It causes harm, and she becomes susceptible to the abuse of evil powers. Because Sophia is not united with Christ herself, she experiences pain and suffering in the material world, just as Mary Magdalene did, according to Luke's gospel. But in the story, Christ incarnate in the person of Jesus is sent to enable her, as Mary Magdalene in this painting, to again see the light, bringing her knowledge of the Spirit. Christ is also sent to all of us to bring us the knowledge and wisdom needed to rescue ourselves psychologically and spiritually. So if we look at Sophia's story as the story of the human psyche, then we can see that in her myth, that when our psyche loses its connection with the wisdom contained in our unconscious, and particularly loses connection with our higher self, the inner Christ, as Carl Jung put it, then life becomes a greater struggle. We self-sabotage. We make ourselves more susceptible to harm. Well, now let's move on to another myth explained anew by another psychoanalyst. The self-proclaimed founder of modern psychology was the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He can make that claim because he might have been the first to argue that our behaviors, as well as our thoughts and beliefs, were primarily governed by unconscious drives and conditioning, and not, as many thought, reason. Nietzsche's first book addresses this idea. Its title is The Birth of Tragedy, and it primarily focuses on the two aspects of human personality, the Apollonian, after the Greek god Apollo, and the Dionysian, after the Greek god of wine and revelry, Dionysus. Apollo represents order, rationality, as well as the plastic arts like sculpture and painting. Apollo is also responsible for Greek drama. Dionysus represents pure vitality, the chaotic, and the intuitive energies deep within us. The art form Nietzsche ascribed to the Dionysian was music. Music, because it bypasses the mind and it goes straight to the soul and the body. Isn't that so? We don't have to analyze it when we hear it. We immediately feel it. Now, Nietzsche argued that since Socrates, we have favored only the Apollonian forces within us to the neglect of Dionysian. We have thus lost a certain vitality and meaning to life, as well as lost our intuitive powers. Now, some of us may believe that, of course, the Apollonian devotion to order and reason are a better way to live than the wild revelry of the Dionysian path. Well, let me ask you, if that's the case, then why do so many under the age of 40, perhaps you did this when you were under 40, go out and dance all night at clubs, or go out and get wildly intoxicated, or fall under the spell of charismatic cult figures? Well, the reason is because something deep within us needs to experience ecstasy, or what Nietzsche called Rausch, a German word meaning a rush of exuberant feeling. Rausch, I love that. Apparently, reason isn't enough to give us a satisfying life. Think about that. Isn't that so? If Apollo offered us beauty and order through the plastic arts, Dionysus offered us ecstasy through the art of music. The greatness of Greek tragedy, according to Nietzsche, was the combination of both drama and music. There was a balance. How can we get the balance back? The balance between Apollo and Dionysus that Nietzsche advocated. Well, one obvious way is through the suspension of disbelief that comes from movies that offer the rush of a great soundtrack to go along with a captivating dramatic story. Get lost, in other words, get lost in the story, in the myth. Feel the music that plays during particular scenes. Now, I know many of you have seen at least one of these films. Did any of you at one time during the middle of the film ask yourself, well, wait a minute, did this really happen? Because if it didn't really happen in history, then it's worthless. I'm going to get up and leave the theater. Did any of you ask that? I don't think so. So we should stop asking of our myths the scientific materialist question, did this really happen? And start asking the psychoanalysts and mythicists question, what does this mean? Another way is to attend more live musicals and concerts. I'll never, ever forget going to hear the Richmond Symphony performing Carl Orff's Carmina Burana. I know that all of you have heard this music before, even if the name sounds unfamiliar to you. So I want to ask you, write this down. Take time today to go to YouTube and search for Carmina Burana by Carl Orff. That evening, many years ago in the concert hall back in Richmond, Virginia, I experienced Nietzschean rausch, wild intoxication from music. Let's move to a religious myth we may be more familiar with, the story of Jonah and the whale. Here's a quick summary from the Hebrew scripture. Jonah is a prophet called by God to prophesy to the people of Nineveh that if they don't change their ways, their wicked ways, they will face destruction. Jonah says to God, no way am I going. Because Jonah doesn't like the people of Nineveh. He doesn't want them to change. He wants them destroyed. Jonah tries to escape his calling by sailing far away on a ship. But a huge storm arises, a storm caused by the disobedience of someone on the ship. That's how the sailors interpret it. And they discover that Jonah is to blame. So they toss him overboard. Immediately the seas calm, but Jonah is then swallowed by a great fish, not a whale, a great fish. That's what the Hebrew words dag gadol actually mean, great fish. And Jonah is in the stomach of this great fish for 3 days before being coughed up onto the shore of all places, of course, Nineveh. Jonah then repents of his rebellion, warns the people of Nineveh about their impending destruction if they don't change their wicked ways. They do, of course, and the nation and Jonah are both saved. Now, the simplistic interpretation offered to children in Sunday school is the need to obey what God says or bad things will happen to you. But a Jungian psychoanalysis primarily focuses on the idea of being swallowed by a whale. What does that mean at the psychological level? Well, it's a story of death and rebirth. At various times in our life, we experience some dramatic turn of events, a trauma that leads to an emotional and psychological disintegration. The period of 3 days in this death-like disintegrated state represents the time needed to heal and become whole again, to reintegrate, in other words. In the Hebrew Bible, that is exactly what the number 3 means. Wholeness, completeness, or perfection. It's symbolic, in other words. Don't take it literally. Now, an example of a more modern artistic adaptation of the Jonah and whale myth is in the children's story Pinocchio. As you recall, Pinocchio is the wooden puppet who eventually becomes a real human boy. But in the process, he falls into considerable mischief, a little like Sophia's troubles. At one point in the story, Pinocchio is run off and his creator or father figure, Geppetto, goes in search for him. But Geppetto ends up being swallowed by a whale. Pinocchio hears about this and dives deep into the ocean to look for him. He finds Geppetto and is able to rescue them both. This retelling of the myths also offers a more expansive meaning to the original tale. Here, the father, seeking to save the son, becomes as helpless as a child after being consumed by the whale. And the child then, Pinocchio, must grow up quickly to save the father. Through their desire to save each other, both father and son go through a kind of death in the belly of the whale, but then reemerge to become whole and fully mature and psychologically integrated. Friends, myths and their modern retellings are meant to call all of us to experience a more vital and meaningful life. The process begins with seeking. We have to want it, and necessitates a death as well, a dark night of the soul, as the mystics called it, before a rebirth into integration, individuation, as the Jungian psychoanalysts call it, or salvation, as the religious like to call it. Now, our final myth, and one very popular with artists, is that of the abduction of the goddess of spring, Persephone. She's abducted by the powerful god of the underworld, Hades. Sometimes it is referred to as a rape of Persephone, not an abduction, like in the title of this masterwork by Bernini. But all Greek versions of the tale give no indication of an actual rape. This myth is also a story of death and rebirth, but from a decidedly feminine perspective. Now, even though he was a powerful god, Hades was deeply lonely. He longed for a companion, a life partner, to keep him company. While visiting the upper world, Hades noticed the young and beautiful Persephone picking flowers in a meadow. He instantly was head over heels in love, or at least highly infatuated with her. So Hades did what Greek gods do. He grabbed Persephone against her will and dragged her into the underworld with him, and then forcibly made her his wife. Well, I think it's safe to assume that Persephone does not love Hades at this stage in their drama. She probably even hated him for destroying her innocence and taking her away from her family. Persephone's mother, Demeter, goddess of agriculture and harvest, was devastated when she realized her daughter was missing. She searched day and night looking for her beloved daughter, neglecting the world's plants and leaving them to wither and die. Well, the god Hermes joined in the search and eventually found Persephone in the underworld with Hades, demanding she be set free. But when faced with the wrath of the gods, Hades tricked Persephone so she could never leave. Here's what he did. He gifted her a pomegranate, and she ate several of its seeds, not knowing this divine law that anyone who ate from the depths of hell would be forced to stay there forever. Now, let me repeat those words. Anyone who ate from the depths of hell would be forced to stay there forever. How would you interpret that statement psychologically? Let me go on. Some versions of the story indicated that Persephone actually grows to love Hades. and embraces her new and powerful role as co-ruler of the underworld. Well, eventually a deal was agreed. Persephone would spend 6 months of the year on Earth with Demeter, her mother, and the other 6 months in the underworld with her husband, Hades. Greeks believed, ancient Greeks at least, believed this led to the birth of the warm and cold seasons. When Persephone was underground, the plants and seeds would wither up and die, making autumn and winter. But when she returned, life would have begun blooming again, leading to spring and summer. Obviously not a great scientific explanation, but once again, let's look at this from a psychoanalytical level. The various versions of the story all imply that Persephone does grow to love Hades, and they rule together quite successfully as husband and wife, with Persephone now taking the title and more powerful role of goddess of the underworld. But what does this story mean at a deeper level? Well, for starters, it expresses the deep love of a mother for her daughter and the lengths she will go to save her daughter. It also represents what women of more ancient times genuinely experienced. Being betrothed at a very young age, usually about the age of 16, to a strange man much older than they were, and all the fear and apprehension such a situation would bring a young woman. But if the woman, instead of fighting this situation, creatively adapts to it, she may eventually find fulfillment. At least that was the understanding in ages past. But what of its application today for us? Like the other stories, the story of Hades and Persephone is one of death and rebirth. Persephone is taken to the underworld. Maybe we could look at that as her unconscious, or a place to experience her own dark night of the soul. But through the aid of greater forces, her mother, other gods, the talents of a highly skilled therapist, perhaps, she finds a creative solution to her dilemma and a chance at rebirth and fulfillment. Now, I want to make this clear. Persephone did suffer initially. Life often teaches us only through suffering. When we heal, the scars and painful memories are still there. We just learn to live with those memories, those scars. In fact, it is the memories of our suffering that give our life a greater depth of meaning, offer us the broader perspective of greater wisdom, and give us the power of empathy and understanding in order to help other people. The fact that Persephone now must navigate both worlds is also important as I see it, particularly for women. I think still today, because of the obligations of marriage, motherhood, and now vocational responsibilities, women must navigate multiple worlds and are expected to do it successfully. So the myth of Persephone is still vitally relevant today for you women among us. And the myth deserves to be retold by our best artists, our best filmmakers, our best novelists. So in closing, let me ask you, in the days ahead, let us turn our attention to the stories, the myths that speak to us most powerfully. What are they for you? Perhaps more importantly, let us seek out those ancient myths that meant so much to our ancestors and may have once meant so much to us, and see if they can once again enliven us and inspire us to a more expansive way of living, if we don't take them literally. Well, with that, I'd like to open it up to any thoughts or questions that you might have. And again, if you need me to go back to a slide, I'll do that. The floor is now open. Please feel free to speak.